Okay, today's lecture is going to be pretty short. We're going to focus on methods in Java, and you are familiar already with methods. Methods are what called functions in Python. So it's the same thing. Those, remember how we wrote definition, something, something, like a little piece of code that would perform some sort of action for us. That's what methods do. But in Java, it's the same thing. The only difference is the syntax, but they work essentially the same way as they work in Python. So again, a little recap. So why would we write methods? Because we want to break our program into smaller parts. Because remember how we talked about it in PLD 101 and in the Python class, that we want to approach writing code with a divide and conquer approach, which means that if we have a big task in front of us, we want to break it down into smaller pieces so we can focus on those small pieces and solve them one by one instead of trying to solve the big problem as one. That's just going to take more time, more effort, and sometimes it's way easier, in most cases, it's way easier to break it down into smaller pieces and then solve those pieces accordingly. And obviously, your program is going to be simplified if you split it up, into smaller pieces. So you will know exactly where, if you have any issues with your program, you will know exactly where that issue is coming from because you will know that you broke your program down into smaller parts. You know what each part should be doing. And if something goes wrong, you know which part is responsible for that error exactly. Now, there are two different method types. So the first one is void and the second one is value returning method. And what that means is the void method is just going to perform some sort of task for you and it's going to terminate. It's not going to return anything back to you. It's just going to do something and exist and stop existing within your run, kind of. Then the value returning method, what that one does is going to return something back to you. So it's going to perform a certain task, and then it's going to send a value back to your code where you called that method. So for example, this is a void method, system.out.print. That is a void method because it's not returning anything back to you. It just prints something on the screen, but you do not save any values that are coming back from this method. It just prints something out in front of you. However, this, as you can see here, integer parse int 700, what this method does, it takes the string 700, even though it looks like an integer, but remember that everything that is within the quotation marks, that is a string in Java. So a string 700 is we're turning it into an integer using this method, integer.parseInt. So instead of having 700 as a string, after we call this method, it will send us a value back of 700 as an integer. And then we store that integer into our variable called number. So this is the difference between the two types of methods. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about them specifically, each one specifically. So when it comes to the void method, you just need to write a header and a body. It's the same way as you wrote them in Python. So you will write a header of your method and the body of your method, nothing else. The header will be on the top. The body will be within the curly braces, because remember in Java, everything is within the curly braces. Let's look at this example right here. So we have our header right here. The first line right here is our header. And we have to specify all of these things, and I will explain to you what they all mean. For now, just know that whenever you want to specify a void method, you need to have the void word inside of your method, the method header, method definition. So this is just the name of your method. These are parentheses. If you want to put any parameters inside, the same way as we did in Python, you will put those parameters within the parentheses. And then this is your body. It's everything that is within the curly braces is going to be your body. And in this case, this method is called display message. And what it does, it just prints hello for us. Now let's look at all of the parts of our method header a little bit closer. So the first one, the right here, public static, it just means that your method is available to everything inside of your class. Remember classes, so everything within that class can access this method. Now, you can also put private. If you put it private, so instead of public, if you put private, that will just mean that only a certain parts of your code will have access to this method. And we will focus on method modifiers later on in this class. For now, you just need to know the difference. If you see public, available to everybody. If you see private, not available to everybody. Now, return type, that's where it comes in, the difference between the void and the value returning methods. So if you put void, that means you're not returning anything. If you want to return some sort of value, you will put the data type of the value that you want to be returned. So whether it will be integer or string, it just depends on which value you want to return. You will put it instead of void. But for now, we only have void. We're not returning anything in this method. And then you'll just put your method name and you will put your parentheses. And in this case, again, it's the same one. We're just printing out hello. Now, method modifiers, as I told you, public means it's going to be available to everybody. Private will be, it means that it's only available to the same class where that method is located. So nothing else outside of that class can belong to it. Now, static, what static means is going to come in a little bit later in this class whenever we start creating our own objects. So static just means that this method belongs to a class and not an object. And again, it might not make sense right now. It will make sense later on. Return type, as I said, is going to be either void or the data type that you want to return. Then the method name should be pretty descriptive. You should specify what that method is doing as best as you can. And then parentheses will either contain nothing or it will contain a list of arguments that you want to pass to that method. And again, I will show you that. If you want to call a method, it's pretty easy. To call a method, you just have to specify the name of the method with parentheses and a semicolon at the end. So whichever method you want to call, you're going to put the name of that method, you're going to put your parentheses and a semicolon, nothing else. Documenting method. All right, passing arguments to a method. If you have a method that will accept certain arguments, it's really easy to send those values into a method. So let's look at this one. We have again, a void method. Remember, void means we're not returning anything. We have a display value method. And we are saying that this method accepts one integer. Any integer, this method will accept it, but only one. If you put more than one, this method will crash. Your program will not work. So only one integer is being accepted. And how do I know it? I look at the parentheses. In these parentheses, they tell me that integer num can be accepted when you call this method. Now, when we actually call it, we put the name, display value, we put our parentheses, and we put whatever integer we want to send into that method. In this case, it's 5. We are sending 5. It's going to go exactly down here, and it's going to take the place of num. So where num is in your body, we're going to replace it with a 5. So let's replace it here. That's what's happening behind the scenes. Obviously, it's not going to happen on your screen, but I'm just showing you how it works behind the screen. So we're going to send 5 into this method. And then let's look what this method does. Let's look at the body. So we are printing the value is, and then we're printing num. But remember that instead of num, what do we have now? We have 5. So what's going to be printed? The value is 5. But it works with any integer. So this method will work with any integer possible. So if you want to send, for example, instead of 5, you would like to send 10 or 100, or it doesn't really matter, any integer. It's going to display that same integer that you're passing into it right here instead of num. Let's see. Data types. So it's very important to know your data types and know that each data type is its own thing. And if you want to send an integer, if you're specifying right here that you're sending an integer, you cannot pass anything else to this method. In this case, we have a double. Remember that double is a float, is a decimal number. So anything that has a dot has a dot notation that is considered a double in Java or a float. Now, these are not the same as integers, so this will cause an error if you try to send this value into your method. So in this case, you're trying to send a 1.0, and the program will look at it and say, this is not an integer. It will look back right here, and it will say, no, this method can only accept integers. 1.0 is not an integer, so I will not allow this to continue, and your program will crash. So how do you fix it? It's pretty easy. Instead of doing double d equals 1.0, you get rid of the double, you put int instead of it, you put integer d equals, and you get rid of this part. So you just leave it at 1. So this way, it will not cause any errors. Your code will run just fine. You can also put multiple arguments. You can pass multiple arguments to your method if you want your method to work with more than one value. This is how you do it. It's very simple. You're just going to list your variables with a comma. So if you want to put 2, 3, 4, 5 or more, you can easily do it. You just need to put a comma and then the name of the next variable and the data type of the next variable. And again, if you wanted to add more, a comma and more, just add more to it. Now let's look at this method and see what it's doing. So we have a public method void, so it's not returning anything. The name is showSum, and it can accept 2 doubles. So 2 float numbers, 2 doubles. Now, this is a little bit of a error right here. They should be 5.0 and 10.0. All right. So we are passing 5 and 10 as values. So instead of num1, we will have 5. And instead of num2, we will have 10. Let's look at what's happening. We are creating a local variable called sum that will hold a double for us. And then we are just adding num1 and num2. What they are is 5 plus 10. So our result will be 15.0. And then we just print the sum is and whatever that sum is. So we're going to print the sum is 15.0. The only thing that you need to be aware of if you're passing multiple arguments is that the order matters a lot. So you need to follow the exact order of these of the same way as you wrote those arguments. You need to follow the same order when you're passing the arguments to when you're passing the values into your method. So in this case, it doesn't really matter because we are only performing a sum. So in this case, it doesn't really matter which value comes first. However, if you're performing division, when you're performing division, that's going to matter a lot because, for example, if we have num1 divided by num2, right? If we pass a 0 as our second value to num2, we're going to be dividing some sort of number on 0, and that's not going to fly. That's going to cause an error. Your program will crash. So just be aware that you need to follow the same order of your arguments, the same order of your values. Let's see, local variables. So the only thing you need to know about local variables, we have one right here. This is what a local variable is, double sum, because it exists within a method. Once the method stops executing, that local variable stops existing. It does not hold any value for you. Even though we assign it to 15 right here, this value will not hold anything after this method is done executing. So that's the thing that you need to know about local variables. Now, how to return a value from a method. Again, that's pretty easy. There's nothing too difficult in here. The only thing that you need to change from your void methods, the idea is the same. You need to have your header, you need to have your body, but you have to specify the return type right here. This is where void was before. So you have to specify the return type, integer, data, integer, string, boolean, float. So any data type that exists in Java, you can return it. And then the only difference is you have to specify what you are returning. And you do it by putting the keyword return, and that's specifying which variable you want to return back to your program. Let's look at the example. So we have a method called sum. I already know it's going to return an integer because right here I can see int. So I know this method will be returning an integer. And in this case, it accepts two integers, number 1 and number 2. Then it creates a local variable called result. It takes the sum of two integers that it accepts, and it returns result back to your program. So in this case, if we pass 20 and 40, the result will be equal to 60. And then we're going to pass back the 60 right here, and we're going to store it in our variable total. Returning a Boolean value, it also possible. The only difference, you need to specify Boolean. And remember, Boolean is either true or false. So these are only two values that you can have when it comes to Boolean, true or false. Now, in here, what we have, we are just validating some number in this method. So it's called isValid. It's going to return a Boolean, and then it accepts a number, some sort of integer. Now, in this case, what's happening, we have a variable status that is of a type of a Boolean, so it can either store true or false. And if our number is greater or equal to 1 and less than or equal to 100, then we're going to return true. So we're checking if our number is within 1 to 100, within that range. If it's not, it's going to return false, and we're going to return false back to our main method. Now, if you want to call a code, this is a piece of code right here. We are checking if our integer value is within the range. Now, we are checking right here if isValid returns true, because this method will either return true or false. If it returns true, we're going to print the values within range. Else, or if it returns false, we're going to print the value is out of range. Reference to a string object. So you can also return strings. The only difference is right here, instead of putting integer, void, or Boolean, the ones that we covered so far, you need to put string with a capital S. Now, in this case, we are sending John and Martin into our method right here. John will be the first name, Martin will be the last name. And what we're going to do is we're going to just add them together, first and last, and we're going to return John Martin into our customer name. Let's see. Yep, that's it for today.